Dr. Von Braun became interested in rocketry as a young child. In fact, he got into trouble as a young child because he taped a bunch of skyrockets to the back of his wagon and lit them and went rolling down the street in Berlin and crashed into the front door of a bank. And his father, Baron von Braun, had to come and keep the bank manager from having von Braun, the young Wherner von Braun, hauled off as a hoodlum. But as von Braun continued to grow, he did experiments at Raketenflugplatz, which was a rocket flying place that he and his friends had built and started doing testing. They actually built a lot of liquid fuel rockets while Wherner von Braun was a teenager. He had gotten a copy of a book by Tsiolkovsky, the great Russian rocket scientist, and Hermann Oberth, who was his predecessor and von Braun's idol. And he and his team were building and flying rockets very, very early on, starting in the late 1920s. So as one of the other jobs that his father had him get after he left the work in the steel industry, he became a taxi driver in Berlin. And at one time, while he was driving a taxi, a couple of German military folks, a captain and a lieutenant, got into his cab, and they were sitting in the back of the cab talking about a problem with the propulsion system of a rocket nozzle. And this 19-year-old taxi driver says, "Gentlemen, if you don't mind, perhaps I can help you with that problem." They said, "What?" And the taxi driver then explained to them what the nature of the problem they were having was. And this was, of course, highly classified in the German military. And he was then told, "Son, how do you know about such things?" And he says, "Oh, we've been experimenting with liquid fuel rockets for several years now." And he was told, "Son, I would like to see you in my office in the High Command tomorrow morning." And so von Braun went to the office and was told that when he had discussed what they had been doing, he was told that they would like him to come and work for the German military. This was in late 1930s. And he and several members of his team that had been working at Raketenflugplatz made the decision they would go and work on rocketry for the German government. Well, they moved first to Kummersdorf, and then they set up a facility on a small island in the far northwest of Germany called Peenemünde, and he was brought there with the other members of the group that he had been working with during these rocket experiments, and started developing rockets in a much grander scale, because now he had a huge amount of money. Previously they had been working on a shoestring, and he and his colleagues started developing what was first called an A1 rocket, and then they got to more and better and larger systems. Ultimately, the rocket they called the A4, which was the V2 that we have sitting here. At that point in time, Germany had entered into the war and had declared war. And of course, this was under the direction of Adolf Hitler, and the development of rocketry was a part of that. Well, actually, Hitler wasn't really all that interested in rocketry. He thought that the war would be decided on the basis of huge guns. He built gigantic guns, artillery pieces, and he built lots of airplanes. So airplanes and tanks and great guns is what he thought. He didn't have a great deal of hope or respect for rocketry, so they didn't get as much support as they might have gotten. And it's fortunate for us that they didn't, because that meant that the development of rockets in Germany was slower. Well, of course, these rockets that were being built were used in war. Some were launched against London and killed people in London. Antwerp became known as the City of Death because many, many people were killed when a V-2 landed on a movie theater not far from the Antwerp Zoo. In fact, one of the V-2s hit the Antwerp Zoo and released lions and tigers and bears, and they were roaming the streets of Antwerp during World War II and actually killing people. So during the war, there were rockets being made with warheads, approximately 1-ton warheads, and they were being used against the Allied forces, and they were also fighting against not just England and the United States, but also the Soviet Union, Russians, and the Russians had intense battles at Stalingrad, for example, and so Von Braun participated in this because he was German, and for him to have not been a part of the German military and developed these rockets, he would have been considered unpatriotic, and in fact, most probably he would have not just been considered unpatriotic, he would have probably been sent to a concentration camp or maybe even executed by Adolf Hitler. In fact, on one occasion, one of the early V-2 launches that occurred, Wherner Von Braun was heard to say, "The rocket was a success. Unfortunately, the rocket landed on the wrong planet." And that was turned over to Hitler, and Hitler had Wherner Von Braun imprisoned, because the problem was Von Braun was really interested in rocketry from the standpoint of space exploration. He didn't really want to build rockets for warfare, but that was what he had to do during that time because there was a war going on. As the war came to an end, Von Braun knew that the stormtroopers that had been sent there to Peenemünde were there to protect the German rocket team, but if it looked like Germany was going to lose the war, they were there to exterminate the German rocket team, because Hitler did not want this technology to fall into the hands of the British or the Americans or the Russians, who of course at that point in time were the enemies of Germany. So Von Braun and his team manipulated a way of escaping from Peenemünde. They came up with a fake name of a special project, and they had the initials of this special project done on a bunch of trucks and rail cars, and they had loaded up lots of rockets and rocket components and documents. Of course, Peenemünde had been bombed tremendously by the Allied forces, by the British and the Americans, and Von Braun almost died during one of these bombing raids. But they escaped and went to the southern part of Germany, and then ultimately into Austria, and stayed in a small ski lodge called Haus Ingeberg in Oberjoch, not far from the little village of Schwarzwald. So Von Braun did participate in the war, but his participation was, of course, in development of rockets. And in fact, near the end of the war, they were working on what was called an A-10. And the A-10 was a multi-stage intercontinental ballistic missile that would have been capable of being launched from Germany and hitting Washington or New York. But fortunately, Germany lost the war, and the entire rocket team wanted to surrender to the Americans, and they ultimately, Wherner Von Braun's younger brother Magnus, when they heard that Adolf Hitler had died while valiantly defending the fatherland, which was a bit incorrect, but the kind of propaganda that was being done in that day and time. When Magnus said that he would go and try to find the Americans. The war had just ended, and not everyone knew that it was ended. He got on his bicycle and headed to try to find the Americans. And as he rode down the mountainside from Haus Ingeborg, a couple of American soldiers from Schwarzwald had heard him coming and hidden in a ditch. And as he came closer, Private First Class Frederick P. Schneikert jumped up and pointed his weapon at this guy riding a bicycle with a white flag on the handlebars and yelled in German, "Halt, komm vorwärts mit der Hände hoch." Well, Magnus was a bit astonished hearing this American soldier yelling at him in German, but he obeyed. He dropped his bicycle, he put his hands up, and he walked toward Schneikert, and he says to him, "Take me to Ike." The Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe at the time, of course, was General Dwight David Eisenhower. And this poor private was not about to be able to take this guy to Eisenhower, but he took him back to Schwarzwald, and there at the tank command was Major Charles Stewart, and Charles Stewart had his job was to learn everything he could about V2 and V1 rockets. And here was this private telling him that he was bringing him the brother of Wherner Von Braun. And Stewart looks at Schneikert and he says, "Well, son," he says, "you've either gotten the greatest captive in the history of World War II, or you've captured the biggest damn liar." Well, it turns out that he wasn't a liar. They took Magnus in and fed him real eggs and bacon and coffee, which was a great treat to Magnus von Braun. And he spoke with them. They then went to Reuter and they had more interrogations. And Magnus was then told that he should go back to Haus Ingeborg and the next day bring Wherner von Braun and other members of his team to come and meet with Stewart and other members of the American team that was trying to learn everything they could about V2 rockets. So they came, and Wherner von Braun and Dieter Hutzel and Dornberger, who was the military man in charge of the rocket team, a total of 6 of them came, and they met and told that they had buried at Goslar a large number, over a ton of documents relating to the V2. And then at Nordhausen, there were these caves where they were actually building and assembling V2 rockets. Well, this posed a problem because Nordhausen and Goslar were in territory that, according to the division that had been made at the end of World War II, that territory actually belonged to Russia. And a telegram was sent out to the group at Schwarzwald that they were to remove nothing whatsoever from the region that was the property of the Russians. And a decision was made that, well, the message that had come in had been garbled and they couldn't really understand what was said, so the response came back, "Would you please resend this message? We were unable to understand what you said." And this was a way of stalling for time, because they then went and as quickly as possible retrieved the documents where they had been put in a salt mine in Goslar and dynamited, the entrance dynamited shut. And they went to the places where the V2 rockets were being assembled and recovered a number of V2s and a huge quantity of parts and components. And those were put in vehicles on railroad cars and moved to Antwerp, where they were put on ships and then brought back to the United States of America. And some of them, of course, went to England as well. But that was the reason that we wound up getting such an incredible amount of technology. that had been developed by the German rocket scientists and had been developed for warfare, but then came to be, first of all, a part of our own military development, because after the war, we ultimately entered into a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and it was very, very important that we develop intercontinental ballistic missiles. And at the White Sands missile range, which had been the White Sands proving grounds, they assembled and developed the perfection of many of these V-2 rockets. For some while, Wherner Von Braun and his team had a job of training the Americans how to build and fly V-2 rockets, and ultimately the Redstone and the successor rockets to the V-2. But for a period of time, Von Braun and his team considered themselves prisoners of peace. They were allowed to stay there and work there, but they were told that they should not communicate with anyone on the outside. In fact, it's kind of amusing that they were all there illegally, because this had been a top secret project called Project Paperclip. It was originally Operation Overcast, but when some of the Germans near where the rocket team members were being housed before they were transferred to America started complaining that the Overcast people were getting special treatment, and then they discovered that the word Overcast, which was classified top secret, had been compromised. They changed the name of the operation to Operation Paperclip. And then the German rocket scientists were simply brought into America. No customs, no immigration control. They were dropped off into Fort Bliss, and they started building and testing these rockets at the White Sands Proving Ground, which then became known as the White Sands Missile Range. And all of a sudden, a few years after they had arrived, the President of the United States at that time, now Dwight David Eisenhower, was president. He made the decision that all illegal aliens in the United States of America were to be removed. And this caused a tremendous problem at White Sands, because some 125 German rocket scientists and engineers were there, and none of them were legal, had been legally admitted to the United States of America. So they came up with an interesting plan, and they were told that they were going to be going to Juarez, Mexico that coming Sunday to attend a bullfight. And Joseph Berm, a dear friend of mine, told me while we were on a flight to England, he told me the story of something that happened to him, and that was that he had been brought there with the rest of the German rocket scientists and engineers. He had no idea whether his wife was still alive or whether his mother was still alive, because when they had left, his mother was, I think, in Berlin, and as I recall, his wife was in Stuttgart. I may be wrong about that, but that was essentially the essence of it. And he had no idea whether either one of them had survived. So he wrote a letter to his mother and addressed it to her. He had managed to get his hands on some Mexican postage stamps and some stationery. And when they made this trip to Juarez to go to the bullfight, Joseph Berm sort of trailed along at the end of the group, and when they passed by a mailbox, he slipped over and dropped his letter into the Mexican mailbox. They went to the bullfight, and then when they came back across the border, and every one of them presented their passport, and they were dutifully stamped that they had entered the United States of America through immigrations and customs at the Mexican border between Juarez and Fort Bliss. So basically, they were now in the country legally. because all of their passports had been properly stamped. Joseph Boehm then waited and waited and waited, and he heard nothing from his mother. He heard nothing about the letter that he had sent. And he told me during this flight to England that he was absolutely terrified. He was terrified that he might have been caught, and he was terrified that he might have been executed for violating the law in which they were not only not supposed to communicate with anyone in Germany, they were not even supposed to communicate with anyone on the outside in the United States. And he said he got very, very little sleep. And all of a sudden one day, he received a letter from his wife telling him that she had received the letter that he had addressed to his mother and where she was and that they were all okay. And all of a sudden he realized that the American intelligence agencies had watched every single thing that they did when they went to the bullfight and had seen him put the letter in the mailbox and had the Mexican police remove the mailbox, and then they had taken it back and searched his letter for microdots and invisible ink to try to find out if he was divulging secrets or saying something that he shouldn't. When they finally realized he was just trying to find out about his family, they changed the address and sent the letter on to his wife and allowed him to receive the response back. This, he told me, he absolutely had tears in his eyes when he told me this story, because he told me how much it meant for him to realize that the Americans had caught him in this horrible act of disobeying their rules and laws about communicating with anyone. And not only did they not execute him, they didn't even punish him, and they allowed him to get the information as to what the characteristics, what the situation of his family was. Well, that story, of course, went to all the members of the rocket team from Germany that were there, and that showed them that America was a dramatically different place than Germany, a dramatically different place than Russia, because he said if he had done that sort of thing in Germany, he would have been executed. He would have probably been executed if he had done that sort of thing in Russia. And here it was in America that they not only didn't punish him, they didn't even mention that they knew what he had done, and they allowed him to get the information about the health and welfare of his family. The basic point is there were horrible things done during World War II. The V-2 rocket was a part of the war, and it caused great damage. There was also the Allies were bombing huge portions of Germany, and in fact Peenemünde was bombed extensively by the British and the Americans, and Wherner Von Braun almost died during one of these bombing runs. So it was a terrible time, horrible things were done, but Von Braun became a devoted American citizen. He and his entire time in 1955 went into the gymnasium of Huntsville High School, and they all took their oath of citizenship. So they all became citizens of the United States of America, and they were the team that propelled America to the pinnacle of the space program and ultimately the development of this wonderful Saturn V rocket that launched the first human beings from the planet Earth to the moon.